Well, good morning. Welcome to our webinar on improving your business process management with Office 365. Spreadsheets have been around for ages for project tracking, and there's really nothing wrong with that. But if you're still using Excel spreadsheets for project tracking, this presentation is for you. BlueNet delivers services across all three of these different categories. Today's session focuses on initial deployment. This is something that you can do right away, no matter where you are on your journey with Office 365. Our topic today certainly applies to you. We also deliver services across these three types of solutions, and this topic is definitely an information worker level solution. This is something that anybody with an Office 365 subscription should be able to get into and get going. So if you're using Excel tracking spreadsheets today, you're going to learn how Office 365 makes them completely obsolete. If you manage people, you're going to be doing it more effectively because Office 365 is a collaborative environment, and you can way more easily manage people when you're doing it all together in the same set of tools. And if you're managed by somebody, you're going to be more efficient because you're not going to be wasting a lot of time trying to keep other people appraised of what's up and where things are going. All right, so today we're going to briefly cover the pros and cons of using Excel for tracking. Cover the benefits of converting to Office 365. This is primarily SharePoint, Teams, and Lists, but we're also going to spend a small amount of time on planner boards because they are certainly an option that you should be aware of. We'll discuss the different ways you can make the transition from Excel into Office. And then I'm going to kind of overwhelm you with a couple of real-world customer examples that we're very, very proud of here at BlueNet. So why do managers exist in the first place? Well, it's because modern project management involves multiple people, often in multiple locations, over a period of time, working more or less independently. And so managers exist because they're trying to keep this process sort of in hand and underway. Now, traditionally, you did this in the days before ubiquitous computing with all sorts of boards with sticky notes and magnets and that sort of thing. And clearly we can do a better job than this, because you had to physically be present in front of these things to figure out what's going on. So definitely not a very collaborative, not a very connected way to do it. So everybody embraced spreadsheets in a big way. And so now the world is littered with hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands and thousands of Excel spreadsheets that are attempting to do the same things that used to be done on these physical boards. So the Excel tracking spreadsheet, pros, it's super easy to create. Anybody with a copy of Excel around can fire up a workbook and start typing column headings and start typing whatever they want. It's also extremely flexible. You can rapidly add additional columns, add additional rows, you can move stuff around. And so there's really no downside in the early days of going with this. The cons are it's file-based. So somebody has to have the right version of the right file or you're not up to date. That's probably the worst thing about file-based systems is if you aren't working on the current version, you are possibly behind, possibly misupdating and so on. There's also no versioning or access control. If you can open the spreadsheet, you typically can make changes just about anywhere in the spreadsheet unless somebody did a lot of work to try to lock the thing down. It just isn't an easy thing to control. It's also very passive. The spreadsheet just sits there. It doesn't do anything unless it's open in front of your face and you're looking at it. We're going to see that when you move it into Office 365, we got all sorts of activity going on. And then lastly, it's very difficult to integrate the interior of a spreadsheet with anything else in your organization. So as you might be unsurprised to hear, an Office 365 version of this removes all these cons and retains all of the pros. So that's why we're here talking about this today. All right, so here is a super simple example of an Excel project tracking spreadsheet. So it's got a couple of rows and columns, and you can see then here in a SharePoint site, the same project tracker has a similar appearance to a spreadsheet, as the rows and columns and that sort of cellular editing capabilities and so on. And so it's a pretty easy transition to make for most people. So let's drill in a little bit and see what makes SharePoint a much better place for this sort of thing. So as I described, functionality, very similar to Excel data tables. We can filter, we can sort, we can reorganize that data set just the same way an Excel data table would work. You have a single, simple, stable location. It's a URL you go to, and everybody who clicks that URL, whether it's a bookmark or some part of navigation or something, they go directly to the correct version of that data. No tracking, trying to figure out. It's also a very sophisticated security model. If for some reason you need to control it, you can go down to the line item access and change who gets to do what in that data set. Just like in Excel, it's very easy to add columns to an existing an existing SharePoint list. Extensive data validation capabilities. So if you want to make something required or optional, or it's got to be a positive whole number, it's got to be a date in the future, has to be a date in the past. These are all things that you can do to make sure that data has more integrity. It's intrinsically multi-user access. So 50 people can be simultaneously using this SharePoint tracking list, and there's no problems there at all. We have extensive versioning that we can enable. So unlike an Excel spreadsheet, once you hit save, you pretty much have overwritten whatever used to be there. And unless somebody hung on to an old copy or a backup of that file, it's going to be difficult to tell what happened. With versioning enabled, that tracking SharePoint list will let you know who created what, who made which changes to which fields over time. And then lastly, one of the cons with the Excel version was that this was a passive situation. Once it's in a SharePoint list, we can attach workflow automations to this so that we can not have to have people manually looking for things to do. The workflows and automations can alert you and actually take action when necessary. So these are all the pros here. All right, so how do you make the transition? Well, SharePoint has the ability to take a spreadsheet and convert it to a list. I don't recommend using it because the amount of time you spend cleaning it up is pretty extensive. Because if you just try taking your typical tracking spreadsheet with all sorts of weird stuff going on in the background, you're going to regret the mess that it makes. So if you really want to go this route, extensive cleanup of that file first will take you a long way. Another possibility is you can do a copy and paste operation with the clipboard. You can set the list up and then just simply use the clipboard, and I'm going to be demonstrating that in a moment. Possibly the best way to do this, especially if this is a tracking process that a lot of people are going to be using in a complex scenario, study up on the SharePoint features and start fresh, all right? There's all sorts of different task list templates that are already present. There's a lot of different field types in SharePoint lists that don't exist in Excel. In Excel, most things are just you type, and Excel doesn't care what you type into a cell. It'll take just about anything, and that's one of the downsides to it. SharePoint has a lot of very sophisticated field types like people, list pickers, date pickers, that sort of thing that you can take advantage of when you're doing it. So let's take a look here. I'm going to go and bring up this Excel-based project tracking, and I'm just going to copy into the clipboard the data, and then in my project tracker here, I'm going to go into list edit mode, and I have carefully set this SharePoint list up to have the same fields in the same order. So once this thing is in the clipboard, I can just hit the paste key, and boink, 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 I've got all of this information has now been added to the list. So I now have the same sort of sorting and filtering capabilities that I saw in Excel. I have the easy ability to add additional fields. So if I want to add a cost element or something like that, I can go and simply say that, you know, what did this cost, you know, that sort of thing. It's real simple to work with this information. I don't want to spend a lot of time going into a lot of extreme details about this, so I'll just briefly say that this whole process has extensive customization capabilities, and you don't have to just leave it as is. There's a lot you can do to make it a little bit easier to do. All right, so a whole bunch of typical complaints I hear when we try to move folks who've been doing project management in Excel forever. They say, my managers love their spreadsheets. They do a lot of other things in spreadsheets, far beyond just the tracking part. They like their spreadsheets. Or, hey, I'm in Outlook all day long. That's where I get my work done, in Outlook. I don't want to leave Outlook to come back in and work with this. Sometimes printed reports are necessary, and SharePoint lists really don't print. They do a really poor job of printing. And then lastly, if you've got a ton of data entry to do, some people will say it's so inefficient in a web page, it's tedious, I hate doing it. What do you say to all these different complaints? Well, the main thing is that just because it's inside SharePoint doesn't mean it is limited to staying there forever and ever and ever. And so we can connect a list to Outlook, we can export it to Excel, we can even open it in Microsoft Access to do sophisticated, higher speed data entry and querying and so on. So there's a lot of options here. You're not restricted in any way to staying in SharePoint all of the time. All right, so you've probably seen Excel tracking information in an Excel spreadsheet where they're using color coding all over the place, attempting to make the spreadsheet easier. You know, what's going on? Well, for one, there's just way too much information in the spreadsheet typically. And so you've got a single view essentially in a spreadsheet that everybody has to use. And therefore color ends up being used, and filtering and sorting ends up being used to try to make it have a little bit more sense to it. Excel filters, I think, are kind of dangerous because it's not obvious when something's filtered, especially when you've got a large number of columns. So here's an example of a patient tracking spreadsheet that we're going to be using as a case study. This is real. This is a real thing from a customer, and you can see that there's just so much information going on, dozens and dozens of columns. Which ones were used to sort? Which ones are being used to filter? Why are some of these things green and red and yellow, etc.? It's kind of frankly overwhelming. So the answer to this process is that, and this is a huge advantage of using SharePoint, is we can have multiple views on these project tracking systems. So my view, maybe as a sales support person, is maybe I need the pre-project fields are important to me. And so I don't really need to see all sorts of columns that aren't useful until way late in the process. So, but perhaps a different user says, well, I don't do anything in the pre-sales area. I'm part of the service delivery team, and I don't really care about 90% of what goes on leading up to this deal. I need to see the stuff that's important to me at the end of this deal. And so with Excel, we really don't have any way to support that. In SharePoint, we can have as many different views for as many different people as we want. And then on the integration side of things, Excel has a difficult time integrating data from other sources. Technically, you can do it, but it's a pretty advanced power user and beyond level, whereas when it's in SharePoint, you've got all sorts of different options to integrate with the rest of the organization. So again, I just don't have the time to go a deep dive into this, but if you want to know more about it, give us a call and we can take you through. All right, so I want to oh, I forgot alerting, and we'll talk about that in a second. All right, so I want to take you through that case study. You saw that original spreadsheet that had 50 plus columns, hundreds and hundreds of rows, and we were able to successfully convert that into a single SharePoint list with a half dozen different views that optimized each person's role in the process. So here's a one view. It's called the general information view. This is used by manager types that just want to get a high level overview of what's going on. We also have a practitioner view so that different individuals can drill into the stuff that makes sense for them. So it's an instant filtering on just their information, and that information is displayed to them in a practitioner orientation, which is maybe very different than somebody who does services delivery or management. Color coding is still available. We don't like to use color coding extensively in SharePoint if we can avoid it, because it can get a little busy and hard to follow. But here's a view called status, where there's some aggressive color coding, and so it's very clear to see the red items that are not started. Somebody's in the cost estimation area has got a lot of work to do here, so they better get going. Whereas our prior auth status folks are in pretty good shape. All right, here's yet another view called Ready to Deliver, and again, this is just illustrating that we can focus on the right set of data for this person's role, who doesn't necessarily need all of the other data. Attempting to pull this off in in Excel would be very difficult, and in SharePoint, it's a matter of clicking the mouse a half dozen times and you've got the view. All right, so here are some other typical things that happen in all project management situations that has nothing to do with Excel or SharePoint. Things like, hey, did you ever get to that task I assigned to you? You haven't. Well, when you do, let me know. Or I need a status update before the end of the week. If you're using an Excel spreadsheet, you have to open the spreadsheet and roll and scroll around trying to get to this information. Or you got to go bother somebody and ask them about it. And that's an inefficient way to do it. When you put stuff inside of a SharePoint list, you have extensive alerting capabilities. So as you can see on the slide here, I have options to get all changes anytime they change. I can focus in on just new items being added. I can focus in on when changes are made, and so on. And so this gives you the ability to sort of have SharePoint automatically sending you alerts when something significant is going on. We had a customer who was able to eliminate a standing weekly meeting that covered exactly this sort of information, and people just got a weekly digest in their inbox on Fridays saying, here's everything that changed on this project. You don't have to have a meeting to literally list these things out. All right, another thing that happens in all project management situations. There might be only one correct way to handle a particular situation. So you see a certain pattern of data, this is overdue and the customer contact field is blank or whatever. You know, if somebody has to be trained to do the same thing every time, that's a training and management issue. Or sometimes you change policy, right? So everybody's been trained in on how to do this correctly, but now we changed the policy. How do you know if people are using the new policy? Have they even been told about the new policy? Again, if you're using Excel, it's a passive system. It's very difficult to monitor this. And then approvals. You know, a lot of times there are approval processes, but they start getting in the way. So is it always needed? Well, no, there are certain exceptions. And now people have to be trained in on those exceptions. That's why one of the most exciting things about using SharePoint is you can attach flows and Power Apps to them. These are very sophisticated workflow engines. They can apply if-then logic to say, if this scenario is true, then approval is required. If this scenario is true, these 4 conditions are true, then we don't need a human to do this. We can just mark this as completed because we know. So a routing, alerting, we can do just about anything. Workflows can be launched when new items are added. They can be launched when changes are made. You can manually start them. Lots of different options there. And again, I wish we had 90 minutes to spend on this stuff. I could go on long and deep about any one of these slides, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to say this is true, and you'll have to contact us to learn a little bit more about it. All right, managers love accountability, right? And so in an Excel spreadsheet, it's really difficult to go on a cell-by-cell basis and say, who created this, who modified it, et cetera. SharePoint lists have extensive tracking about who created a record, who modified a record, complete version history, a complete history of workflows that have been launched, and so on. So this allows a savvy manager to be able to say, how long is it taking as these items transition between these different states? I have enough detail in this accountability data set that I can say, it takes us 3 weeks and the bottleneck is right here in week 2. This takes a full 7 days and it really should have taken a day. All right, if you're not using any kind of accountability, it's very difficult to discover this stuff. It ends up with a lot of meetings and evaluations and so on that here we're just getting them for free because all this data is recorded. All right, so next level are dashboards. In a dashboard scenario, you present only the most important information for a specific person's role, and the dashboard should be optimized and organized for an action to be taken by a person in that role. And so here's an example of a industrial machinery repair facility where they used to have an Excel tracking spreadsheet. You had to go into the office and call it up to see where there were issues in their daily process. And so it took a manager constantly going in there and then trying to track down the right people. And so there's a gigantic screen. It's a huge flat screen is up in the service bay right now. And it has sort of a live view of all of the different service technicians, what they're stacked up on and what's going on. And so we can see here that Matt Klatt is not having a good day. He is waiting on parts for every single one of his jobs that are pending. And so a manager should do one of two things. Hey, let's get a parts expediter going on that, or reassign Matt to help somebody else out. Because maybe, you know, Tim and Josh there, and even Ben have a whole bunch of green stuff that's in progress. He could be helping out on that instead of standing around waiting on parts. So this is an example of a dashboard that is adding a tremendous amount of value to the entire organization, and it's all based on a live query against a tracking list. It's pretty slick. All right, and I want to sort of wrap things up with a call out to Planner. This is a relatively recent addition to Office 365 that a lot of people don't realize exists, or they've seen it but they don't understand it. If you've used Trello, Jira, you know, many others, it's very similar. The main advantage to Planner is that it's very tightly integrated into Teams and the rest of Office 365. And so my recommendation is to experiment with it so you can tell if it's going to be a good fit or not. Here's an example of an internal operations team planner that we use here at BlueNet. You can see there's a bunch of different sort of buckets here, and then different tasks are added to different buckets. It's a drag drop kind of capability, so you can move a task between buckets. You can change their status. You can set little color coding flags to draw attention to things. And so if this is essentially what your project tracking spreadsheet is doing, you don't even need to use a SharePoint list or anything. You have all of this capability right here. So just a call out to that. With that said, I'm going to turn it over here to any Q&A that might be popping up. I got to go and take a look at the chat here. Okay. Right, so the question is, how difficult is it to make changes to the views that I've been you know, crowing about in this whole process here? And let me bring you over to it here. This is the default view, is the all items view, and if you really want to make a universal change to this view, we can just go into the sort of the back. Sorry, the list settings here. I gotta find it. There we are, list settings. And we see the list of different views are present here. So here's the all item view. And you can see that I've got the ability to change the sort order of the different columns. I can get rid of them if they're not relevant to everybody. The all items view is, as you know, the thing implies, ostensibly everything, and you probably want to leave that alone for the most part, and instead create additional views. So this might be the hit create view here, and perhaps this is the, come on, baby. There we go. So we'll create a standard view. Apparently my internet is being a little slow here. So maybe this is the needs approval view. Is this a view just for me, or is this one that everybody should be able to see? I'll say sure, it's for everybody. We perhaps don't need to see the job ref on this, and we don't need to see the completed flag on this. And we do want to put a filter here that says if this is completed, then it needs review. And you see there's tons of different other options here. We'll just say that. Oh, sorry. Yes. All right, so here are the all items view, and you can see that they're there, and here's a needs approval view. Here are some things that need approvals. Notice that the job reference and approval flag has been removed from this view. So you can, again, create as many different views as you want, as many as you want to get the job done. It doesn't take any more effort than that. All right, any other? Okay, question is, what does Planner cost? Planner is free, I guess. You don't pay for it as a separate SKU. Planner comes with most Office licenses, not all of them. I'm not a licensing expert, but most of your typical plans, whether they're business essentials or E3s and so on, come with teams and so on. And so Planner is probably free for your organization. All right, well, we've pretty much come up on 40 minutes plus, and I try to keep these things a little tight. So any further questions, you feel free to send them to us here at bluenetinc.com. There's my email address on there. I'm happy to take questions going forward, but thanks for attending, and we'll see you next time.